Before we get into today's case, I would like to thank Switchcraft for sponsoring this video. Switchcraft is a fantastic game where you play as Bailey, who is top of her witchcraft academy, but his best friend has just gone missing, and it's up to you to get to the bottom of the mystery. Switchcraft is a graphic novel-style mobile game with incredible writing and artwork. The aesthetic is really something, and the visuals are all hand-painted. I also like that the story is based around modern-day witches and has a strong character, which you can use to make decisions and choose the direction of her journey. Also, there are over 85 characters from all types of backgrounds and 1,000 plus magical match 3 levels, which are great fun and very satisfying to complete. Download and play Switchcraft for free and unlock the magical mystery. I'll leave a link in my description box. Make sure you check it out, as it really helps the channel if you use the link. Today we will be looking at a case from the second part of the 19th century, so sit back as we go to the USA. In the 1870s, the Osage township in Kansas was a sleepy small settlement on the Great Osage Trail, an old Native American routeway through this part of the Midwest. Travellers passing through had the option of staying at the Wayside Inn, a dingy establishment run by the Bender family, but guests might end up getting more than they bargained for. The history of the Osage Township, like much else in the American Midwest in the 19th century, was shaped by the relocation of its Native American people. When the American War ended in 1865, the US government moved the Native Americans who lived in Labette County in Kansas to a new reservation in Oklahoma. The newly vacated land was given out to homesteaders. In 1870, much of the land around what became known as the Osage Township came into the hands of 5 families of spiritualists. These families had been inspired by the religious movements of the Third Great Awakening in mid-19th century America. One of these families was headed by John Bender Sr., who arrived with his son, John Jr., as well as his alleged wife, Elvira, and her daughter named Kate. John Sr. was about 60 years old, and Elvira was in her early 40s. Although John Sr. presented her as his wife, some local residents considered it more likely that Elvira was in fact his sister. John Jr. was 25, and Kate was 23. The family were a curious lot, commonly believed to have hailed from Germany or the Low Countries. John Sr. did not seem to have a good command of English, while Elvira, or Ma as she liked to be known, always made out that she found it difficult to communicate, although it was very apparent that she had a better command of the language than she would let on. John Jr. and Kate were far more fluent and would often speak on behalf of their parents. The Bender family got on with making their life in Osage Township as comfortable as possible. By the end of 1871, they'd erected a cabin and a barn. They'd also established a large vegetable garden and planted trees on a piece of enclosed land to make an orchard. They made the best use of the cabin as they were able. It was only small, but they used one half as their own fairly remedial dwelling place, and the other half was converted into a general store and an inn. This they named the Wayside Inn, a drab little place with poor accommodation for a sole traveller or 2 sharing a room, but at least it was dry and provided shelter for anyone who was in need of somewhere to stay for the night. Most of the neighbours thought that the family were quite strange. John Jr. was prone to bouts of aimless laughter, while Kate claimed to be a healer and told anyone who cared to listen that she was able to communicate with the dead. She would conduct seances and give lectures on spiritualism. When it became known that she advocated free love, her reputation grew, and the inn run by the family started to become a well-known stop for men who needed a place to rest while travelling on the Great Osage Trail. When these travellers came into contact with John Sr., he was the only family member who they would usually comment about. He was certainly someone who seemed to have a lasting effect on all of those who met him. He was often described as a brute, a repulsive man, with barely a trace of civility in his character. He and Elvira did not socialise much and kept to themselves. Kate and John Jr., however, were more approachable and both attended the local Sunday school. Despite John Sr.'s inhospitable manner, Travellers continued to stay at the inn, and those who did soon found out that they had to contend with more than just the poor decor. In the early summer of 1871, the body of a gentleman named Mr. Jones was discovered in Drum Creek, not far from the Wayside Inn. There was no clear indication of who had committed the crime, although the owner of Drum Creek was suspected, owing to his sheer proximity to the murder. A few months later, 2 bodies were discovered out on the prairie near Osage Township. What was curious to the locals was that these 2 new victims were found with their throats cut and had been hit with a blunt object, the same fate that had befallen Mr. Jones, who had been found in Drum Creek 6 months earlier. Although the trail had long since gained a reputation as a place where those travelling along it may come across horse thieves or villains, by 1873, the reports of missing people who had passed through the area had become so well known that many began to avoid it altogether. Vigilance committees formed, but instead of keeping the peace, they often arrested innocent men, claiming that they were responsible for the disappearances. These men would later be released by the authorities. Some would then return to their homes, while others who were still under suspicion were run out of the county by the committees. Following the discovery of the bodies out on the prairie near Osage Township, investigators tried to piece together what little information they could, as they needed to find the perpetrators of these grisly crimes. However, it took a good while before it was discovered that both of the deceased had been misfortunate enough to stay at the Wayside Inn. The manner in which these murders were carried out was seemingly fairly systematic. Kate, the alleged healer, was an outgoing, attractive young woman, one whom male suitors often called at the Wayside Inn to see. Within the small room, the inn guests were seated next to a canvas wall, which separated the inn from the rest of the family. While they were distracted by Kate, Mr. John Bender Sr., or his son, would come forward from behind the canvas wall and hit the unsuspecting visitor with a heavy blunt instrument, probably a sledgehammer. Kate or her mother would then come forward to make sure the victim was dead, and if they were not, they would finish them off. Wealthier guests, who might have money on them or arrived with horses, were particularly likely to suffer this fate. Afterwards, the bodies were thrown through a trapdoor of a back room into a cellar, where they were stored before they could be dispensed with, somewhere out on the prairie or in Drum Creek. After a time, the Benders began burying their victims in their orchard. In the course of 1872 and 1873, several further murders were committed. Ben Brown from Howard County in Kansas had a large sum of money on him and was killed and then buried in the orchard. W.F. McCrotty visited the Wayside Inn in 1872. He had arrived with a wagon and a team of horses, something that the family knew had much value. He never left the establishment. In December 1872, a gentleman named George Launcher visited the inn with his infant daughter. They were relocating from Independence in Kansas and had planned to settle in Iowa. As a result of this, Mr. Launcher was travelling with a rather large sum of money on him, some $1,900. However, George Launcher and his young daughter never arrived in Iowa, as they too were buried in the Bender's orchard. Shockingly, it was later discovered that the girl was buried alive. Around the same time, a man named Johnny Boyle was killed, most likely to claim his horse and saddle. Bizarrely, Mr. Boyle's body was thrown down the Bender's well. The murders continued into 1873. By now they had killed at least a dozen travellers, perhaps more. But one of these killings would trigger an investigation that would bring an end to the macabre hospitality being offered at the Wayside Inn. In the spring of 1873, Dr. William Henry York, a friend of George Launcher, whom the Benders had killed along with his daughter the previous December, decided to head out to Kansas, along the same route that the Launchers had taken. He had not heard from his friend in some time, and wanted to discover where he had gone missing. Dr. York passed through the Osage Township region in mid-March 1873. However, he was never seen again. Dr. York's disappearance resulted in a full-blown search throughout the Osage region of Kansas. This was led by his brothers, who were prominent individuals in this part of the Midwest. One of them, Colonel Alexander York, a Civil War veteran lawyer and a member of the Kansas State Senate, arrived to the Wayside Inn on the 28th of March 1873. There the Benders confirmed that Dr. York had indeed stayed with them for the night, but had left the next day. They speculated that perhaps he had been attacked by someone on the trail. This was a possibility Colonel York was willing to consider, and headed off to investigate further. There the matter might have ended, but by now, many of the local people who resided in Osage Township had become suspicious of the mysterious Bender family, so much so that they brought their concerns to members of the search party. One lady described how she had been chased by Mrs. Elvira Bender with a knife when she tried to visit her at the inn. On the 3rd of April, Colonel York returned to the Bender establishment and confronted the family, all of whom denied the accusations he put to them. In fact, Elvira became so enraged, she told the colonel that the woman who accused her was a witch and had cursed her coffee. She then ordered him and his men to leave her house. However, in doing so, she revealed for the first time that she understood and spoke far more English than she had led people to believe. The men who accompanied Colonel York were convinced that the Benders were guilty and wanted to arrest them. They also wanted to search their property. However, Colonel York insisted that evidence of any wrongdoing had to be found before anything could be done. Before he left, Kate asked the Colonel to come back alone the following Friday night. She told him that by using her clairvoyant abilities, she would be able to find his brother. Around the same time, neighbouring communities started to say that the Osage Township was responsible for the disappearances. In an attempt to maintain order, the Colonel convened a public meeting at the schoolhouse that was attended by 75 locals, including John Bender Sr. and his son, John Bender Jr. Here it was agreed that a search warrant would be obtained to search every homestead between Big Hill Creek and Dumb Creek. This would include all the homesteads in Osage Township. 3 days later, a local farmer named Billy Toole was driving cattle past the Bender property when he noticed that the inn was abandoned and that the farm animals had not been fed. He reported this to the town trustee, who called for volunteers to assist in searching the Benders' property. However, due to the bad weather, it took a few days before this could commence. When the search party, led by Colonel York, rode out to the Bender residence, they discovered that the family were not there, and after a quick inspection of the cabin, it became apparent that they had left in somewhat of a hurry. Despite their mysterious disappearance, the property was searched, and blood residue was discovered in the cellar, along with freshly dug holes in the orchard. The Colonel then instructed his men to dig, and as they did, they began to reveal what looked like a graveyard of the Benders' former guests. These included the body of Colonel York's brother. In the house, several hammers, including a sledgehammer, were located. In the days that followed, much new information was gleaned. It transpired that the Benders were not the Benders at all. A prayer book in the house and other evidence revealed that John Bender Sr. was actually named John Flickinger. His supposed son's real name was John Gebhardt, and Elvira's name was Almira Make Griffiths. Her daughter Kate, who the investigators believed was actually her daughter, was really called Eliza. But whoever they were, they had escaped. Several days later, their wagon was discovered outside the town of Thayer, some 12 miles away from the Wayside Inn. Further investigations revealed that they had headed southwest on trains and various other transport methods. The younger Benders eventually headed to Texas, and from there possibly to New Mexico. John Bender Sr. and Elvira seemed to have followed a different route, heading to Missouri. Within weeks, Colonel York and the governor of Kansas had offered large cash rewards of $1,000 and $2,000 for their apprehension. But by now, the trail had largely gone cold. Would the bloody Benders ever be brought to justice? Many people in Kansas must have wondered. The fate of the bloody Benders is shrouded in Western myth. In the years that followed, there were countless supposed sightings of them all over the country. Yet, despite these sightings, the large rewards that were offered for their arrest in 1873 remained unclaimed. Every so often, a posse of vigilantes was formed on the back of a rumoured sighting, but these never returned with the Benders in tow. What they often found were innocent victims, individuals who were forcibly arrested in cases of mistaken identity, or in a couple of unfortunate instances, people who were killed in the belief that they were members of the missing family. John Gebhardt, or John Bender Jr., as he was known while in Osage Township, disappeared into outlaw territory in West Texas and was never officially seen again. It is unclear if Kate was with him or if she later went to meet back up with her mother in Michigan, where Ma Bender is said to have absconded to. Rumours about their background were discussed for many years, making it difficult to separate myth from reality. Many people believe that John Bender Sr., the coarse patriarch of the made-up family and who could barely communicate with the Wayside Inn's guests, committed suicide in Lake Michigan in 1884, by which time he would have been in his mid-70s. In the same year, an elderly man, matching Pa Bender's description, was arrested in Montana for a murder that was committed near Salmon in Idaho. The victim had been killed by a hammer blow to the head. A telegraph was sent to Cherryvale, asking that someone be sent to see if they could identify the suspect. But in an attempt to escape the irons, the accused man severed his foot from his leg and bled to death. By the time the deputy from Cherryvale arrived, identification was impossible due to the decomposed state of the body. In 1889, a mother and daughter, who had been arrested for larceny in Michigan, were then accused of being Elvira and Kate Bender. Although some people who had known the Benders in the early 1870s believed that the pair were indeed Elvira and Kate, the evidence was vague, and not every witness was able to positively identify them. The judge decided that they had no case to answer and discharged them both. This meant that all the bloody Benders escaped arrest for the crimes that they had committed in Osage Township in the early 1870s, during which time they killed over a dozen victims. The bloody Benders have been immortalised in a piece of American folklore, and they have featured in books, television shows and films throughout the 20th and early 21st centuries, and are as infamous today as they ever were. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for watching what has been the most requested case so far this year. Thanks again to Switchcraft for sponsoring today's video, and be sure to check out the link to the game in the description below. As you know, I always value your comments and feedback, so please leave any that you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next brief case.